the 11th of September. 2001 in New York City, the sky was an almost impossible shade of blue. Cool, sharp, early autumn air. The kind of day that people who lived through it have described again and again in the same words. Perfect. It was a perfect morning. And then, at 8:46 in the morning, everything changed. Not just for New York, not just for the United States, for the world. Within hours, the most documented, most photographed, most watched event in human history was already generating questions. Some of those questions were the natural questions of grief and disbelief. Some were the questions of investigators and journalists trying to understand the sequence of events. And some arriving with surprising speed, almost before the smoke had cleared, were questions of a different kind. Questions that suggested the official account was not the whole account. Questions that have never stopped in the 25 years since that September morning. The theories surrounding the 9/11 attacks have grown into one of the most extensive and deeply researched bodies of alternative history ever assembled. They involve architects and engineers, physicists and demolition experts, former government officials and military intelligence veterans, ordinary people who watched the footage 100 times and found things they could not explain to their own satisfaction. Tonight, we are going to walk through all of it. The famous theories and the lesser known ones, the technical arguments and the geopolitical ones, the questions that skeptics find most compelling and the counterpoints that defenders of the official record find most persuasive. We are going to take our time. You don't need to watch the screen. You don't need to form a verdict. Just settle in, get comfortable, and let the story come to you at whatever pace feels right. This is not a comfortable subject, in the way that some of the things we've explored together are comfortable. It is recent. It cost nearly 3,000 lives. It changed the shape of the world we live in. We'll move through it with care. Let's start at the beginning. To understand why so many people have questioned the official account of 9/11, it helps to begin with the world that existed before the attacks and with the official story itself, as clearly and calmly as possible. The attacks of September 11th, 2001 were carried out by 19 hijackers affiliated with Al-Qaeda, the extremist organization led by Osama bin Laden. The hijackers boarded 4 commercial aircraft: American Airlines Flight 11, United Airlines Flight 75, American Airlines Flight 77, United Airlines Flight 93. They took control of the planes using box cutters and knives. They overpowered the flight crews. They turned the aircraft toward their intended targets. 3 of the planes hit major landmarks. The 4th crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. At 8:46 in the morning, Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. At 9:03, Flight 175 struck the South Tower. At 9:37, Flight 77 struck the western face of the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. At 10:03, Flight 93 crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. After passengers learned through phone calls what had happened to the other planes and attempted to retake control from the hijackers. At 9:59, the South Tower collapsed. At 10:28, the North Tower collapsed. At 5:20 in the afternoon, a 3rd World Trade Center building, 7 World Trade Center, also collapsed. 2,977 people died that day, not counting the 19 hijackers. They came from more than 90 countries. The scale of the loss was enormous. The speed of it was terrifying. The images were burned into the memory of a generation, almost instantly. That is the official account. It is supported by the findings of the 9/11 Commission, established in 2002 and reporting in 2004. It is supported by extensive independent investigation by journalists, historians, structural engineers, aviation investigators, and intelligence agencies in multiple countries. It is the account that has been tested against alternative explanations in more detail than perhaps any single event in modern history. And yet, despite that, doubt arrived almost immediately. A 2016 survey found that more than half of Americans believed the United States government was concealing information about the attacks. Similar skepticism appeared in many other countries as well. That number matters because it shows something important. The controversy around September 11th is not a small fringe afterthought. It is a major part of the event's cultural afterlife. The first conspiracy theories appeared online within hours of the attacks. This was partly because the internet had become widely available by 2001, and partly because the attacks themselves unfolded in public, in real time, on live television. That combination was unusual. Most historical events are understood slowly. They are filtered through newspapers, official statements, archives, and time. September 11th was different. People watched the first impact live. They watched the second. They saw the towers burning. They watched the collapses as they happened. They heard the first official explanations while the day was still unfolding. There was no long pause before questions began. The questions arrived immediately, filling the gaps before a stable narrative had time to settle. Some of those questions came from grief. When something this large and this terrible happens, the mind searches for order. It wants a cause that makes sense. It wants something bigger than randomness, because randomness feels too thin to hold such a catastrophe. People ask whether it could have been prevented. They ask whether warning signs were missed. They ask whether someone knew more than they said. That impulse is not irrational. It is human. Some of the questions came from politics. The attacks led, within months, to the invasion of Afghanistan, and within 2 years, to the invasion of Iraq. The war in Iraq was later found to have been justified, at least in part, on intelligence that was deeply flawed. That experience reshaped public trust. For many people, the lesson of the early 2000s was simple and painful. If governments could mislead the public about weapons of mass destruction, then perhaps the official story about 9/11 deserved to be examined with extra care. That did not automatically make the alternative theories correct, but it did create a climate in which skepticism felt reasonable, even necessary. And some of the questions came from technical observation. Engineers, architects, physicists, pilots, and researchers looked closely at the collapse footage, the impact damage, the fire patterns, the timelines, the air defense response, and the debris fields. Some of them found the official explanations persuasive. Others found them incomplete. A small number found them impossible to accept. Those professional disagreements gave the broader public something important. They made the skepticism feel less like internet rumor and more like a legitimate argument worth exploring. That is one reason the 9/11 truth movement lasted. It was never a single movement in any strict sense. It was a loose network of people, organizations, websites, documentaries, books, forums, and local groups. Some of its members focused on the physics of the collapses. Some focused on intelligence failures. Some focused on financial anomalies. Some focused on Saudi connections. Some believed the attacks were an inside job. Others believed the United States had foreknowledge but did not directly stage the attacks. Still others believed the event had been exploited after the fact, rather than planned from within. The movement never agreed on one theory because the event itself was large enough to support many kinds of doubt. To understand those doubts, we need to understand the atmosphere of the years before the attacks. The late 1990s and early 2000s were a transitional period. The Cold War had ended. The United States was the sole superpower. The internet was reshaping how people discovered information and how quickly ideas could spread. Globalization was accelerating. Financial systems were becoming more interconnected. Television news was becoming more immediate and more fragmented. At the same time, the national security state remained powerful and secretive. Intelligence agencies had grown enormously during the Cold War and had not become any less opaque after it ended. Secret programs continued. Public accountability remained limited. Much of what the public knew about military and intelligence operations came indirectly years later through leaks, hearings, or declassification. That matters, because conspiracy theories do not emerge from nothing. They grow in the spaces where secrecy already exists. The United States government had, by 9/11, a long and complicated history of covert action, misinformation, and hidden programs. Many of those programs were real. Some had been exposed. Others remained partially hidden or only understood after long investigation. So when the attacks happened, and when the official explanations seemed incomplete to some people, the existing culture of suspicion gave those doubts a place to live. There was also the emotional shock of the event itself. The images were so overwhelming that, for many viewers, they felt unreal. The scale of the destruction, the height of the towers, the suddenness of the collapses, the dust, the smoke, the people running through the streets. All of it looked less like ordinary history and more like something staged on a screen. That feeling is important. Human beings are very sensitive to visual inconsistency. When something looks too dramatic, too symmetrical, too cinematic, people instinctively ask whether it was meant to be seen in that way. 9/11 produced exactly that kind of reaction in some viewers. The event was real, but its visual language resembled disaster fiction. That resemblance made some people wonder whether they were watching reality or a constructed narrative. And then there was the speed with which certain details became contested. The question of how the towers could have fallen. The question of why Building 7 collapsed. The question of why the Pentagon looked damaged in such a strange way in early photographs. The question of why air defenses failed so badly. The question of how much the government knew in advance. The question of why the war in Iraq followed so closely after the attacks. Each question, by itself, seemed capable of supporting its own explanation. Together, they created a sense that the official story might not be sufficient. That is often how conspiracy thinking begins, not with one total claim, but with a cluster of unresolved details. If the details are emotionally powerful enough, they begin to connect. Once they connect, a larger narrative forms. In the case of 9/11, the larger narrative was usually one of deliberate deception. Some versions were relatively restrained. They suggested that intelligence agencies had foreknowledge and chose not to act. Some versions suggested that the attacks were allowed to happen because they served a strategic purpose. Others claimed the buildings were brought down by explosives. Others claimed the planes were not the planes the public was told they were. Others claimed the passenger lists, crash debris, flight data, or phone calls did not add up. The movement expanded because it could absorb disagreement. It also expanded because the internet rewarded it. Online forums, early websites, video uploads, and documentary clips allowed people to compare details, freeze frame footage, share diagrams, and build communities around suspicion. In the pre-social media era, this still happened at a scale large enough to matter. By the time video platforms and algorithmic recommendations arrived, 9/11 skepticism had already become a durable genre. The internet did something else too. It allowed people to bypass institutional gatekeepers. In earlier decades, a person who suspected a government cover-up might have no way to find like-minded people. By the early internet era, they could immediately find hundreds or thousands of others doing the same analysis. That gave isolated doubts a sense of confirmation. It also made bad information travel quickly. Not every claim in the 9/11 conspiracy ecosystem was equally grounded. Some were built on genuine anomalies, others were built on misunderstanding, selective editing, or outright fabrication. But once they entered the same digital space, they often reinforced one another. That is part of why the topic became so hard to discuss cleanly. It was not one theory, it was an ecosystem. And the ecosystem persisted because the event itself never felt fully settled to everyone. The 9/11 Commission tried to settle it. The report was long, detailed, and influential. It concluded that the attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda and that the failures in detection and response were the result of systemic shortcomings rather than a hidden plot. For many readers, the report was adequate. For others, it was not. Some critics argued that the Commission had been limited by political pressure and by the desire to avoid assigning blame too broadly. Others argued that it had accepted official explanations too readily. Some noted that the Commission itself admitted to having faced obstacles in obtaining information. That admission became, for skeptics, part of the problem. The very act of investigation became suspect to those who believed the truth was larger than the official record allowed. And once that mindset took hold, every unanswered question became evidence. Why were so many warnings missed? Why did the air defense response fail? Why was there confusion over the timeline? Why were some documents classified? Why did some accounts change over time? Why did the public get different answers from different agencies? Those are not crazy questions. They are the natural questions of anyone who feels that a catastrophic event was not fully explained. The difficulty begins when the search for answers hardens into a single belief that all uncertainty must conceal deliberate deception. That is where the 9/11 Truth movement began to divide itself. Some members became focused on the physics of the collapse, others on the intelligence failure, others on geopolitical motives, others on Saudi Arabia, others on media manipulation, others on the broader idea that the attacks were used to justify a new era of war and surveillance. They all shared a sense that the official version was incomplete. They did not all share the same replacement. That lack of agreement is important. It means the movement was never simply a single claim competing with the official narrative. It was a field of claims competing with one another as much as with the state. And yet, for all the disagreement, the movement held together because it was anchored in a feeling that many people understood. The feeling that something this enormous should have a clearer explanation. The feeling that the public was not told everything. The feeling that if the answer is simple, then why does the event still feel so strange? That feeling has kept the subject alive for more than 2 decades. It is why documentaries are still made about it. It is why engineers still debate the collapse mechanics. It is why family members still ask for more transparency. It is why the attacks remain one of the most emotionally charged and politically loaded events in modern memory. And it is why, even now, the story continues to attract new listeners. Not because everyone who questions it is right, but because the question itself is difficult to let go of. There are moments in history when people accept that they have been given the full story. 9/11 was not one of those moments. It was too fast, too public, too traumatic, too politically consequential, and too entangled with the secretive habits of modern government to settle neatly into one shared explanation. That does not mean every theory built around it is true. It means the space for doubt was there from the beginning, and it never fully closed. And so the theories kept growing. The famous ones, the technical ones, the political ones, the stranger ones, all of them beginning from the same point. A clear morning, a sudden impact, a day that changed everything. And a question that has not stopped asking itself since. Controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. Of all the September 11 conspiracy theories, this is the one that has attracted the most sustained technical attention from both sides. The claim is straightforward in its basic form. The Twin Towers did not collapse because of the aircraft impacts and the fires that followed. They were brought down by pre-planted explosives. In other words, the towers were not simply weakened and then destroyed by gravity, they were intentionally demolished. For many people who first encountered the event through the imagery alone, that claim felt plausible almost immediately. The collapses happened quickly. They appeared smooth. They seemed to drop in a way that reminded people of a carefully timed demolition rather than a building failure. And because the towers were so enormous, so iconic, and so familiar, any visual irregularity felt significant. The theory was developed and popularized most extensively by a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, founded in 2006 by a California architect named Richard Gage. Over time, the organization claimed to have gathered signatures from thousands of architects and engineers who questioned the official explanation for the collapses. That detail matters because it gave the theory a kind of professional texture that many conspiracy claims do not have. It was no longer just a question raised by casual observers. It was being presented as a serious technical disagreement among people trained to understand buildings, forces, and failure modes. The core observations that drive the theory tend to repeat in nearly every discussion of it. The first is the overall shape of the collapse. According to proponents, the Twin Towers came down in a way that looks remarkably similar to a controlled demolition. The upper sections began to descend and then appeared to continue downward with very little visible resistance from the floors below. The towers fell in a largely vertical path, and the symmetry of the descent struck many viewers as unnatural. That symmetry is one of the most important emotional pillars of the theory. In ordinary life, large structures do not usually fail in tidy ways. They twist, they lean, they buckle unevenly, they leave behind partial remains. So when the towers appeared to fall more or less straight down, many people felt that something about the movement did not match their intuition about structural failure. The second observation concerns speed. Supporters of the demolition theory often emphasize what they describe as near freefall behavior. They argue that the descent seemed too fast for a naturally collapsing structure because the upper mass would ordinarily encounter resistance from the lower floors as it moved downward. In a building of that scale, they say, each intact floor should have slowed the collapse considerably. This argument has been repeated so often that it has become one of the central talking points of the entire subject. The answer from the official side is that the collapse was not actually free fall in the strict physical sense, and that the apparent speed can be explained by the progressive failure of the structure once the fire-damaged support systems gave way. In that interpretation, the tower was not falling through intact floors, one by one. It was failing in stages, with each stage unable to arrest the mass above it once a critical point had been reached. The debate over speed is, at its heart, a debate over what counts as resistance and how much resistance a severely compromised structure can realistically provide. The third observation is more atmospheric and more troubling to many witnesses. It concerns the sounds and sensations reported by people in and around the buildings before the collapses. Some survivors, first responders, and firefighters described hearing loud bangs, thuds, or explosions. Others reported windows blowing out lower in the towers. Some recalled a series of jolts or popping noises that, to them, sounded like the detonation sequence associated with a planned demolition. These accounts are powerful because they come from people who were not approaching the event as theorists. They were there, physically present, trying to survive. A firefighter in the chaos of that morning was not reading technical papers or studying the language of structural failure. He was reacting to sounds, vibrations, heat, smoke, and panic. That does not automatically mean the sounds were explosions. Buildings under catastrophic stress can produce many loud and frightening noises. Steel can fail, floors can buckle, elevator shafts can act like chimneys. But for the people hearing those sounds, the impression of explosives was immediate and persistent. The fourth observation involves the collapse of the tower's steel framework and what happened to that material afterward. The World Trade Center towers were designed with a tube-in-tube structural system, in which the perimeter columns and central core worked together to support the building. The official explanation says the plane impacts damaged the core and perimeter structure, and the fires weakened the floor trusses connecting them, which caused a progressive inward pull that eventually led to the failure of the columns. Critics of that explanation have argued that the temperatures reached by office fires and jet fuel fires were insufficient to produce the widespread structural weakening required. They note that jet fuel burns off relatively quickly, and that the towers remained standing for a significant amount of time after impact. The official response is that the fuel itself was not the main issue. The fuel ignited the fires, but the fires were sustained by ordinary office contents: paper, furniture, carpeting, plastics, and other combustible materials. The question then is not whether jet fuel alone melted steel, it is whether the combination of damage, dislodged fireproofing heat, and structural stress was enough to initiate collapse. That is a technical argument, and the persistence of the theory owes much to the fact that the technical argument is not intuitively obvious to most people. Another major pillar of the demolition theory is the dust. In 2009, a paper by researcher Niels Harrit and colleagues claimed to identify in World Trade Center dust samples a material they described as active thermitic material. Thermitic compounds can produce extremely high temperatures and are used in some specialized cutting and demolition applications. For those inclined to suspicion, this looked like physical evidence, not just interpretation, material evidence. The paper became one of the most cited pieces of literature in the alternative 9/11 ecosystem. It gave the theory a more scientific tone, and it allowed advocates to say that the debate was not merely about interpretation of video footage, it was about chemistry. Critics of the paper argued that the methodology was flawed, that the samples were not proven to be representative, and that the red-grey chips identified in the dust had alternative explanations. They also argued that the journal's review process was not strong enough to settle so serious a question. And so the debate remained open in the public imagination, even if not in the scientific consensus. Another recurring argument concerns the logistics of the alleged demolition itself. If explosives were planted in the Twin Towers, they would have had to be installed in two of the most heavily occupied office buildings in the world, while thousands of people worked in them every day without drawing attention. That would require access, planning, coordination, and secrecy on an immense scale. The theory's supporters respond that the buildings underwent construction, maintenance, elevator upgrades, fireproofing work, and other forms of internal access over the years. They argue that enough legitimate work occurred inside the towers to make clandestine preparation possible. The counterargument is simple. Possible is not the same as plausible. A conspiracy of that scale would require a staggering number of people to remain silent for decades. That is why the controlled demolition theory remains so controversial. It is not a matter of one detail. It is the cumulative effect of many details, each one interpreted through a different lens. For believers, the towers looked like they were brought down by design. For skeptics, they looked like they failed under extraordinary but explainable conditions. And, because both sides can point to real observations, the argument has never fully died. What makes it endure is not just the footage. It is the feeling that the footage is too neat, too clean, too aligned. The mind looks at the collapse and asks whether a modern steel-framed skyscraper should ever disappear in that way, under those circumstances, in front of a watching world. That question, once asked, is hard to forget. The collapse of Building 7, if the Twin Towers are the central exhibit of the controlled demolition theory. Building 7 is often treated as the more difficult and more unsettling example. 7 World Trade Center was a 47-story office building located north of the North Tower. It was not struck by an airplane. It did suffer damage from debris when the North Tower collapsed. Fires burned on several floors throughout the day. And then, late in the afternoon, the building fell. That fact alone has made Building 7 a focal point for years. To many people encountering the subject for the first time, the question is immediate and intuitive. How does a modern skyscraper collapse on the same day as the Twin Towers without being hit by a plane? And why does it fall in a way that looks so symmetrical? The collapse took about 6.5 seconds. It dropped into its own footprint. The roofline remained relatively level as the building came down, which struck many viewers as highly unusual. This is the part of the story that often produces the strongest reaction, even among people who are otherwise skeptical of conspiracy claims. Something about Building 7 seems to sit just outside ordinary expectations. The official explanation is that it was destroyed by fire and structural failure. According to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the collapse began when heat caused a key beam to expand, which in turn led to the failure of a critical column. Once that column failed, the structure could no longer redistribute load effectively, and a progressive collapse followed. The argument is more technical than dramatic. It does not depend on a single dramatic explosion or an obvious impact event. It depends on heat, expansion, structural vulnerability, and cascading failure. That explanation has never satisfied everyone. One reason is the simple visual impression of the collapse. People do not need an engineering degree to notice that the building came down quickly and in a way that looks, at least to the untrained eye, like a planned implosion. The symmetry, the sudden drop, and the compact footprint all feel suggestive. Another reason is that Building 7 was discussed publicly before it actually fell. A BBC reporter famously announced the collapse of Building 7 while it was still standing in the background behind her. That clip has been replayed endlessly by researchers who treat it as evidence that someone knew the building was going to come down. The BBC later said the report had been made in error, based on a wire service or newsroom mix-up, on a day of confusion, with reports coming in at high speed. Such an error is certainly possible. But the existence of the clip has remained useful to skeptics, because it creates an eerie feeling of foreknowledge. That feeling matters more than people sometimes admit. Conspiracy theories are not only built from facts, they are built from atmosphere. And the Building 7 story has a strong atmosphere. A tall building, no plane strike, fire, delay. Then collapse, a reporter speaks too early. A building falls exactly when she should not have known it would. For many people, that combination is enough to keep the question alive. The official response also faces a more general skepticism about the building's vulnerability. Building 7 was not a simple tower with no unusual history. It housed a range of offices, and like many large buildings in a dense urban area, it had complex internal systems and vulnerabilities. The fire suppression systems were compromised. The debris from the North Tower collapse caused substantial damage. The building was exposed to a chaotic environment for hours. In the official reading, all of those factors matter. In the skeptical reading, they still do not fully explain the totality of what happened. The phrase "fell into its own footprint" became important here because it suggested precision. And precision in a disaster context makes people think of design. That is one of the hardest things to separate from the evidence itself. Modern people have seen too many demolition videos, too many implosions, too many controlled collapses. We know the visual language. So when Building 7 appeared to speak that same language, the comparison arrived naturally. The challenge is that visual similarity is not proof of identical cause. A building can resemble a demolition for reasons other than demolition. But Once the resemblance has been seen, it is difficult to unsee. That is why Building 7 remains one of the most emotionally persistent parts of the 9/11 conspiracy landscape. It does not merely raise a technical objection, it raises a symbolic one. If a plane hit the Pentagon and the towers fell from impact and fire, then Building 7 is an awkward but explainable footnote. If it was something else, then Building 7 becomes the place where the deeper story begins to show itself. That is why it keeps returning to the center of the conversation. Not because the official explanation vanished, but because the alternative explanation never stopped feeling, to some observers, strangely plausible: the Pentagon theory. The claim here is that American Airlines Flight 77 did not strike the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11. Instead, according to various versions of this theory, what hit the Pentagon was a missile, a smaller aircraft, or even a bomb placed inside the building. This theory grew partly because the Pentagon is not just another office building. It is one of the most symbolically important structures in the United States. It is the headquarters of the American defense establishment. It represents military power, intelligence coordination, and national security itself. So when it was struck, and when the early images of the damage began to circulate, the event immediately took on a different kind of meaning. For many viewers, the first thing that stood out was the shape of the damage. The initial hole in the building seemed too small to some people. A Boeing 757 has a wingspan of approximately 124 feet. Early photographs of the impact site appeared, to skeptics, to show a breach that was much narrower than that. The image seemed inconsistent with the idea of a fully loaded commercial aircraft striking the building at high speed. That visual mismatch became the first major pillar of the Pentagon theory. If a plane hit the Pentagon, why wasn't the damage more obviously plane-shaped? Why were the wings not visible in the opening of the building? Why did the earliest photographs appear to show a relatively small, almost tidy impact point rather than the wide structural destruction one might expect from a large jet? These questions made an immediate impression because people instinctively compare what they see with what they think should have happened. A jetliner is large, a Pentagon wall is solid. The relationship between the two in the imagination ought to be obvious, but the reality of a high-speed impact is less intuitive. The official and engineering explanation for the apparent size discrepancy is that the wings of a commercial aircraft are comparatively fragile. They are large, but they are thin. They are not designed to punch through reinforced concrete walls. They would be destroyed on impact or torn apart before leaving a clean impression of their full span. The fuselage and the landing gear, by contrast, are denser and more rigid. Those elements would have had the greatest chance of penetrating into the structure. In that explanation, the absence of a giant plane-shaped hole is not evidence that no plane struck the building. It is evidence that the plane did not behave like a rigid object. It broke apart. That distinction matters. The human eye tends to imagine impact in terms of whole objects colliding whole, but at the speeds involved, a passenger jet is not a single solid block. It is a complex machine, and much of it is vulnerable to fragmentation on contact with a hard surface. What remains visible after such an event may not look like the original form at all. Another point, often raised by skeptics, concerns the absence, in early photographs, of large amounts of recognizable wreckage. There were no fully intact engines resting neatly on the lawn. No large sections of fuselage sitting visibly in the open. No obvious aircraft tail section in the first images that circulated. For many people, that absence felt suspicious. It seemed too clean, too stripped down, too incomplete. But again, a high-speed collision with a fortified structure can produce a very different aftermath than a slower crash in an open field. Pieces are shredded, embedded, burned, scattered and in some cases drawn inward by the collapse of the building itself. The official record also points to eyewitness testimony. Multiple independent witnesses reported seeing a large commercial airliner approaching and striking the Pentagon. Those accounts came from people in the area, including individuals with different vantage points and different backgrounds. They did not all describe the plane in identical terms, but the overall pattern of testimony pointed toward a large passenger aircraft rather than a missile or a small craft. There is also surveillance footage. The Pentagon itself had security cameras. Nearby businesses had cameras. The videos were not high resolution, and they did not provide a long, clean view of the impact, but they did capture motion consistent with an aircraft striking the building. Supporters of the official account argue that the combination of eyewitness testimony, video evidence, flight records, and recovered wreckage is more than enough to establish what happened. The wreckage itself is another major point in the debate. Photographs taken after the attack show aircraft parts among the debris, including pieces consistent with a commercial airliner. The identities of passengers and crew were confirmed through DNA analysis. Flight 77's black box recorders were also recovered and analyzed. The flight data recorder showed the aircraft's trajectory. The cockpit voice recorder preserved the final moments of the flight and the presence of the hijackers. This is one of the most important counterweights to the Pentagon theory. A conspiracy theory can cast doubt on an image. It is much harder to cast doubt on the totality of physical, forensic, and data-based evidence assembled afterward. Still, the Pentagon theory persists. Why? Because the visual first impression is powerful, and because first impressions in disasters often become permanent. Once a person sees a small opening and expects a large plane, the mismatch lingers. Even when later explanation arrives, the original unease can remain. The theory has also persisted because the Pentagon impact has always felt to some people like the least visible part of the day. Unlike the towers, it was not streamed in the same continuous visual way. Unlike Flight 93, it did not leave behind a widely circulating story of passenger resistance. The Pentagon crash happened quickly, and the public's mental image of it has always been less vivid than the image of the towers. That lack of vividness creates room for doubt, and where there is room for doubt, conspiracy narratives tend to grow. There are also versions of the Pentagon theory that go beyond the claim that no plane hit the building. Some argue the aircraft was replaced in the public story by something else entirely. Some argue the attack was staged to manufacture a military response. Some argue the absence of broad visual documentation is itself suspicious. But the more extreme the theory becomes, the more it has to explain the eyewitnesses, the wreckage, the flight data, the DNA, the recorders, and the absence of any verified alternative aircraft or missile evidence. That is why many researchers, including skeptics of the broader 9/11 narrative, consider the Pentagon theory to be one of the more thoroughly examined and more thoroughly rebutted claims in the entire field. And yet the theory survives, not because it is the strongest of the alternate theories, but because the visual anomaly at its center remains so easy to grasp. A large plane, a small hole, a fortified wall. That image, once planted, is hard to dislodge. The insider advanced knowledge theory. Separate from the question of who carried out the attacks is the question of who knew they were coming. The insider advanced knowledge theory occupies a more moderate position than the full inside job claim, but it can also serve as a bridge into more extreme interpretations. In its softer form, it suggests that parts of the United States government or Allied intelligence services had enough warning to prevent the attacks and failed to act effectively. In its stronger form, it suggests that some officials knew the attacks were coming and deliberately allowed them to proceed. This theory is important because it rests not on one dramatic claim, but on a series of documented failures. The 9/11 Commission itself recorded many warning signs. There were intelligence reports about Al-Qaeda activity. There were communications intercepts. There were warnings from foreign governments. There were individuals on watch lists. There were unusual patterns in the summer of 2001 that, in retrospect, look ominous. One of the most famous examples is the presidential daily brief delivered to President George W. Bush on the 6th of August, 2001. Its title, Bin Laden Determined to Strike in US, has become one of the most quoted phrases in the entire post-9/11 historical record. That document did not specify the exact date, target, or method, but in hindsight, the phrase has become a symbol of the larger failure. How much was known? How much was ignored? How much was buried inside bureaucratic fragmentation? How much was lost because one agency did not fully communicate with another? Those questions lie at the center of this theory. The official account says the failure was institutional, not conspiratorial. The intelligence community, in that reading, was full of blind spots, rivalries, poor coordination, and overload. Information existed, but it was not assembled into a coherent threat picture in time. There was too much noise, too many agencies, too many assumptions, too much inertia. That explanation is plausible. Large bureaucracies often fail in exactly that way. A warning is received, but it is not prioritized. A report is translated too slowly. A clue is treated as too vague. A signal is lost in the volume of other signals. The skeptic's response is not necessarily that the failure could not happen. It is that the pattern of failures looks too convenient. If the attacks were not prevented, that may have been because the people in charge were incompetent, or it may have been because something deeper was going on. Some researchers focus on individual officials within the national security establishment. They ask who received which warning, when they received it, and what they did after receiving it. They look at chains of responsibility and moments when action could have been taken. They argue that the accumulation of missed opportunities looks less like random error and more like a system that was either compromised or guided toward inaction. Others focus on financial anomalies. In the days before the attacks, there were unusual trading patterns involving put options on airline stocks, including American Airlines and United Airlines. Put options rise in value when a stock falls, so a dramatic increase in such bets can suggest foreknowledge of a negative event. This became one of the more tantalizing parts of the insider knowledge theory because financial markets leave records. Money moves, trades are logged, patterns can be examined. Investigators looked into the airline put options and concluded that the unusual activity could be traced to routine market behavior and a pre-attack analyst report about the airline industry. In the official reading, there was no evidence of a coordinated insider profit scheme. Still, the fact that the investigation happened at all shows why the theory took root. People were looking for a material trail. A financial trace seemed like the kind of evidence that would be hard to fake or dismiss. The theory also persists because it sits in a morally ambiguous space. It does not require, in its moderate form, that government officials planned the attacks. It only requires that they had enough warning to act and did not act effectively. That is a much easier claim to imagine. And once people begin with that claim, it is not a large step to move towards something darker. If they knew enough to stop it, why didn't they? If they didn't stop it, was it because they were unable or because they did not want to? Those are the kinds of questions that keep the theory alive. It is not a neat theory. It is a theory of gaps, failures, delays, and suspicious omissions. That may be why it has endured so well. People are often more comfortable believing in deliberate evil than in institutional ineptitude, but both possibilities can lead them in the same direction, toward doubt. The Saudis and the 28 pages. This theory belongs to a different category from the others, because it is not, strictly speaking, a theory in the usual sense. It is a question about official documentation that was withheld for many years and only later released. The 9/11 Commission's final report was accompanied by 28 pages that remained classified when the report was published in 2004. These pages were widely known to exist. Senators and other officials who had read them described them in unusually strong language, but the public was not allowed to see them. That alone made them a magnet for speculation. What was in them? When the pages were finally declassified in 2016, they revealed connections between some of the hijackers and individuals with ties to the Saudi Arabian government. Two names became especially important: Fahad al-Thumairi, a Saudi consular official, and Omar al-Bayoumi, a Saudi national who had contact with two of the hijackers while they were in San Diego before the attacks. The official position, maintained by both the FBI and the 9/11 Commission, was that these connections did not demonstrate that the Saudi government as an institution sponsored the attacks. Al-Bayoumy's role in particular was described as ambiguous. That word, ambiguous, became a point of tension. Ambiguous means not fully explained. It means a connection exists, but the meaning of the connection is not settled. For many families of victims and for many independent researchers, that was not enough. They wanted to know why the pages had been hidden for so long, if they contained information that was not, on its own, explosive. They wanted to know who knew what, and why certain details had been kept from public view. That pressure continued for years. Then, in 2023, the FBI declassified additional documents related to its own investigation into Saudi connections to the attacks. Those documents identified al-Bayoumi as a Saudi intelligence asset. That did not automatically prove that the Saudi state planned the attacks. But it did add weight to the argument that there was more to the Saudi side of the story than the public was initially told. This is one reason the Saudi connection remains such a sensitive topic. It sits between conspiracy and record. There are real documents, real names, real relationships, real classified material, real lobbying, litigation, and political tension. But the full picture remains incomplete. That incompleteness is exactly what conspiracy narratives feed on. If an official document is hidden, people assume the hidden material must be vital. If an official document is released years later, people ask why it was hidden. If a connection is admitted but not fully explained, people wonder what else remains unstated. In that sense, the Saudi pages are not just part of the story of 9/11. They are part of the story of how secrecy itself generates suspicion. And unlike some of the more dramatic theories, this one never fully depended on speculation alone. It depended on delay, on classification, on partial release, on the sense that something was being held back that is often enough to keep a question alive for decades. The thermite and nanothermite theory. We touched on this briefly in the context of controlled demolition, but it deserves its own space because it represents the most technically ambitious attempt to provide physical evidence for the inside job hypothesis. Thermite is a compound that, when ignited, burns at extraordinarily high temperatures, hot enough to cut through steel. It has industrial and military applications. Thermite is a variant that includes additional components and is sometimes used in specialized demolition. The importance of thermite in this theory is simple. If thermite was present in the World Trade Center buildings, it could theoretically have been used to cut through load-bearing steel. That would provide a mechanism for the controlled demolition hypothesis. In 2009, Niels Harrit, a chemistry professor at the University of Copenhagen, and several colleagues published a paper in an open-access chemistry journal claiming to have identified what they called active thermitic material in dust samples collected from the World Trade Center site after the collapses. The substance, they argued, was a form of nanothermite, a more refined version of the compound with higher energy density. If true, this would be a remarkable finding. It would mean that an incendiary compound capable of cutting structural steel had been present in the buildings, providing at least one possible mechanism for the controlled demolition hypothesis. The paper received significant attention in the 9/11 Truth movement. It was cited repeatedly in documentaries, online articles, forums, and presentations. It gave the theory a more scientific tone, because it was not just about interpretation of video footage, it was about chemistry. It was about a physical substance. The paper's authors claimed to have found small red-grey chips in the dust. They said their analysis showed that these chips contained unexploded thermitic material. They argued that the properties of the material were consistent with nanothermite, rather than with ordinary paint primer or other common substances. The claim was extraordinary. The paper was widely criticized in the scientific community. Critics argued that the methodology was flawed. They said the samples were not proven to be representative of the entire dust field. They pointed out that the red-grey chips could have other explanations, including paint primer used on the building's steel, corrosion products, or other common materials found in any large building. They also criticized the journal in which the paper was published, noting that it had a non-standard peer review process. The journal was not a mainstream chemistry journal with a conventional review system. It was an open access journal with a different editorial structure. That detail mattered because in science, the peer review process is supposed to be a filter. If a paper passes through a strong peer review system, it has been examined by independent experts. If it does not, there is less confidence in its conclusions. The paper's authors maintained their findings. They argued that their analysis was correct. They said that the chips they found were genuine and that the thermitic material was unexploded. The debate has continued without resolution in the broader scientific literature. What makes the thermite theory significant, beyond the specific technical claims, is that it represents an attempt to bring the 9/11 Truth movement out of the realm of visual analysis and into the realm of physical chemistry. It is an attempt to say, here is a piece of material. Test it. The answer is in the substance itself. That is a powerful move. Visual analysis is subjective. People can look at the same footage and see different things. One person sees a controlled demolition. Another sees a progressive collapse. The argument becomes a matter of interpretation. But chemistry is not subjective. It is verifiable. If nanothermite was present in the dust, it could be detected. If it was not present, it could not. That is why the paper was so important to supporters of the theory. It offered a path to a definitive answer. The fact that this attempt has not produced scientific consensus, that the findings remain contested rather than confirmed, is itself informative, though it is interpreted differently depending on where one stands in the broader debate. For skeptics, the lack of consensus is evidence that the theory is weak. They say, if the material was so important, why has no mainstream scientific body confirmed it? Why has no independent laboratory replicated the findings? Why is the paper still an outlier in the scientific community? For supporters, the lack of consensus is evidence of suppression. They say, the scientific community is closed to the findings because they are politically inconvenient. They argue that the mainstream has not seriously examined the evidence, because it would undermine the official narrative. Both interpretations are possible. Both are unprovable. And that is why the debate continues. The thermite theory is not a minor detail. It is one of the most important technical claims in the entire 9/11 Truth movement. It is the claim that physical evidence exists to support the inside job hypothesis. Whether that evidence is real or not is a question that has not been settled. The dust samples remain, the analysis remains, the criticism remains, the counter-argument remains. And the argument continues not because the evidence is clear, but because the evidence is not clear. The theory survives because it speaks to a deeper desire for certainty. It offers a physical object as the answer. It offers a substance. It offers a chemical. It offers something that can be tested. That is a powerful promise, but the promise has not been fulfilled. The scientific community has not accepted the findings. The mainstream has not adopted the explanation. And yet the theory persists. The Israeli intelligence theory, among the more sensitive and potentially dangerous strands of 9/11 conspiracy theory, is a cluster of claims involving Israeli intelligence. These claims vary significantly in their specifics. Some focus on a documented event. In the hours after the attacks, 5 Israeli citizens were arrested in New Jersey after being observed by witnesses apparently celebrating as the Twin Towers burned across the Hudson River. They were held for several weeks, subjected to polygraph tests and interrogation, and eventually deported to Israel. The FBI investigated and found no evidence that they had foreknowledge of the attacks. 2 of the 5 later gave a television interview in Israel in which they said they had simply been documenting the event, that they were already in position because they had gone to the site when the first tower was struck. That part of the story is documented. The 5 men existed. They were arrested. They were questioned. They were deported. The FBI found no evidence of foreknowledge. But the story did not end there. Some researchers connected these men to a broader theory involving Israeli intelligence operations in the United States before 9/11. They pointed to a reported DEA investigation into what appeared to be Israeli students conducting surveillance operations at various government facilities in the months before the attacks. The Israeli government denied any intelligence operation. The connection between these events and the attacks themselves is not documented. There is no evidence that the 5 men were connected to the planning of the attacks. There is no evidence that the DEA investigation was connected to the planning of the attacks. But the proximity of the events in time, and the fact that 5 men were involved in both, created a narrative that was difficult to dismiss for some people. The Anti-Defamation League and other organizations have noted that the more extreme versions of the Israeli intelligence theory shade directly into anti-Semitic conspiracy frameworks. Claims that Jews or Israel orchestrated the attacks to draw the United States into wars that would benefit Israeli interests, draw on older anti-Semitic tropes, and have been extensively documented as harmful and factually unsupported. That is important to note. The documented facts, the 5 men in New Jersey, the DEAR reports, exist. The interpretive framework built around them ranges from legitimate questions about intelligence sharing between allied services to deeply harmful and unfounded anti-Semitic narratives. These are not the same thing, and they deserve to be distinguished from each other, even in the context of a calm, neutral survey of what people have believed and why. Why does this theory persist? Partly because it involves a real event. The 5 men were arrested, they were questioned, they were deported. That is a concrete fact. Partly because it involves a real allegation. The DEA investigation existed, the surveillance operations were reported. Partly because it involves a real emotional response. The behavior of the 5 men, whether innocent or not, was disturbing to witnesses. Celebration at a tragedy is not a normal response. But the theory also persists because it taps into a much older set of conspiracy narratives. The idea that Jews or Israel control world events, that they manipulate governments, that they orchestrate wars for their own benefit. These are old ideas. They predate September 11th by more than a century. They have been used to justify violence, persecution, and discrimination for generations. When those ideas are applied to 9/11, they take on a new form. The attacks become a pretext for war. The war becomes a benefit for Israel. The conspiracy becomes a global plot. That is not a new conspiracy theory. It is an old one wearing new clothes. That is why the theory is so sensitive and so dangerous. It is not just about the attacks. It is about the people who are accused of orchestrating them. It is about the history of anti-Semitism. It is about the power of conspiracy narratives to draw on older, deeper, more harmful ideas. The theory also persists because it sits at the intersection of real facts and unprovable claims. There are real facts, there are unprovable claims. There is a gap between them. And in that gap, the theory lives. The broader globalist framework, at the furthest reach of 9/11 conspiracy theory, some researchers situate the attacks within a framework that goes beyond any single government or intelligence service. In this view, September 11th was a manufactured crisis, one of a series of events designed to accelerate the consolidation of global power in the hands of a small transnational elite. The attacks were not planned by Al-Qaeda alone. They were planned, or allowed to happen, by a group that had a larger agenda. That agenda was the creation of a new world order. The attacks justified the Patriot Act, which dramatically expanded domestic surveillance. They justified the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the TSA, establishing new layers of government control over the movement and activity of ordinary citizens. They justified two major wars and a global war on terror that created conditions in which the state could exercise extraordinary powers with minimal accountability. Whether this represents intentional design or opportunistic exploitation of a genuine tragedy is something that different researchers in this space answer differently. Some say the attacks were planned as part of this larger agenda. Some say the attacks were allowed to happen because they were useful. Some say the attacks were not planned at all, but were exploited after the fact. The documented reality of post-September 11th policy is that civil liberties were curtailed significantly. Government surveillance expanded enormously, and the national security state grew in ways that have proved difficult to reverse. This is not in dispute. The question of whether these changes were the intended outcome of the attacks rather than their consequence is the dividing line between the mainstream historical account and the more expansive conspiracy framework. In the mainstream account, the attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda. The government responded with policies that were politically motivated, but not pre-planned. The changes were the product of fear, opportunity, and political calculation. In the conspiracy account, the attacks were either planned or allowed by a group that wanted those changes. The policies were not the product of reaction. They were the product of design. That is a much larger claim. It requires a much larger conspiracy. It requires a much larger group of people. It requires a much longer timeline. And yet the theory persists because it speaks to a deeper feeling, the feeling that something larger is happening, the feeling that the world is being changed, and that the changes are not accidental, the feeling that the attacks were not just a tragedy but a turning point. That feeling is not wrong. The attacks were a turning point. The world did change. Civil liberties were curtailed. Surveillance expanded. The national security state grew. The question is whether the turning point was planned or accidental. The conspiracy theory says it was planned. The mainstream account says it was accidental. Both are possible. Both are unprovable. And that is why the theory persists. It offers a story that explains the world. It offers a story that gives meaning to the chaos. It offers a story in which the world is not random, but designed. That is a powerful story. And that is why it endures. The engineering record. Of course, not everyone finds these theories convincing. And the counterpoints, in this case, carry particular weight, because the stakes of being wrong in either direction are significant. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, known as NIST, conducted what remains the most comprehensive technical investigation of the World Trade Center collapses. It was a multi-year, multidisciplinary study involving dozens of researchers, extensive computer modeling, physical testing of materials, and detailed analysis of the building's design and construction. The scope of the investigation was enormous. It was not a quick review. It was not a superficial examination. It was a deep, systematic, and sustained effort to understand exactly what happened. Their findings, for both the Twin Towers and Building 7, attributed the collapses entirely to the effects of aircraft impact and fire. They found no evidence of explosive residue. They found no evidence of pre-planted devices. They found no evidence of any mechanism other than fire-induced structural failure. That conclusion is not a single statement. It is the result of thousands of pages of analysis, tens of thousands of documents, and hundreds of technical reports. The American Society of Civil Engineers, the Structural Engineers Association of New York, and numerous independent engineering and physics professors have, over the years, reviewed the NIST findings. They have found them broadly consistent with the established principles of structural mechanics. That is important, because it is not just the government that reached this conclusion. It is the broader engineering community. The controlled demolition hypothesis requires, at minimum, that a large and complex explosive installation was placed in two of the most heavily occupied and carefully secured buildings in the world, without any worker, tenant, security guard, or maintenance staff noticing anything unusual. That is a massive logistical requirement. The World Trade Center towers were not empty buildings. They were working office complexes. Thousands of people worked in them every day. Maintenance crews were constantly moving through the spaces. Security was present. Elevators were monitored. Floors were occupied. For explosives to be installed in those buildings, they would have had to be placed in multiple locations, in multiple floors, in multiple cores, in multiple structural systems. They would have had to be placed without anyone noticing. They would have had to be placed without anyone reporting strange activity, strange noises, strange materials, or strange people. The controlled demolition hypothesis also requires that this installation survived the aircraft impacts without being triggered prematurely. The planes struck the towers at high speed. The impacts caused massive structural damage. Fires ignited immediately. Debris was scattered. The buildings were in chaos. For the explosives to be in place and intact after that impact, they would have had to be protected from the destruction. They would have had to be shielded from the heat. They would have had to be positioned in a way that allowed them to survive the initial impact. And finally, the controlled demolition hypothesis requires that the signal to detonate was sent and received amid the chaos of that morning without any failure. Detonation sequences are not simple. They require timing, they require coordination, they require communication. They require that the signal is sent, that the signal is received, and that the explosives fire in the correct sequence. In the chaos of 9/11, with ongoing fires, collapsing structures, failing communications, and ongoing emergencies, that sequence would have had to work perfectly. These logistical requirements are not impossible, but they are very demanding, and they are demands that have not been met with evidence. The alternative explanation that the buildings failed due to fire-induced structural collapse does not require all of that. It requires only that the damage and fires were sufficient to weaken the structure. That is a simpler explanation. It is a more direct explanation. It is an explanation that is consistent with what we know about how buildings behave under stress. That is why the engineering record remains one of the strongest counterpoints to the controlled demolition theory: the scale of concealment. As with the Apollo conspiracy theories, one of the most practical objections to the inside job hypothesis is the scale of the concealment required, an operation of the complexity described by the most developed 9/11 theories. involving the installation of air traffic failures, the management of financial market positions, and the suppression of subsequent investigation, would require the active cooperation of a very large number of people across multiple government agencies, private contractors, and financial institutions. That is a staggering number of people. The installation of explosives would require engineers, technicians, and laborers. The coordination of air traffic failures would require air traffic controllers, military personnel, intelligence officers, and government officials. The management of financial market positions would require traders, analysts, and financial insiders. The suppression of the investigation would require members of the intelligence community, the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Defense, and the White House. All of these people would have had to cooperate. All of these people would have had to remain silent. All of these people would have had to not leak, not talk, not write, not confess. In the 25 years since the attacks, no participant in such a conspiracy has come forward with documented, verifiable evidence of their involvement. There have been claims, there have been testimonies, there have been books, there have been documentaries, but none of them have produced the kind of corroboration, documents, physical evidence, independent verification that would be required to shift the weight of evidence. That is significant. Whistleblowing in this period has become more common rather than less. Edward Snowden's revelations about NSA surveillance in 2013 demonstrated that individuals with access to classified government operations could and would bring information forward at great personal cost. Snowden did not just leak information, he leaked information that was embarrassing to the government. He leaked information that was politically sensitive. He leaked information that could have serious consequences for national security. And he did it. The absence of an equivalent revelation about 9/11 in this environment is worth noting. If there was a conspiracy of the scale required by the inside job hypothesis, there would have been hundreds of people involved. There would have been hundreds of people with access to the truth. There would have been hundreds of people who could have spoken, and not one of them has produced verifiable evidence. That is not proof that the conspiracy did not exist, but it is a strong practical argument against it. The scale of the concealment required is simply too large. The number of people involved is too great. The duration of the silence is too long. That is why the scale of concealment remains one of the strongest counterpoints to the inside job hypothesis. The Al-Qaeda evidence base. The evidence connecting Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden to the 9/11 attacks was not solely derived from the United States government's own investigation. Intelligence services from multiple countries, including the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and others, independently investigated the attacks and reached the same conclusion about the perpetrators. That is important because it means the conclusion was not just American, it was international. The 19 hijackers were identified through their own documented activities: flight school enrollment, credit card records, visa applications, phone calls, and physical evidence at the crash sites. Each of these hijackers left a trail. They enrolled in flight schools. They opened bank accounts. They sent money. They made phone calls. They traveled. They used credit cards. They interacted with other people. That trail was documented. It was not fabricated. It was not invented. It was real. Osama bin Laden, in a video recorded in November of 2001 and authenticated by intelligence services from several nations, appeared to discuss the attacks in terms that were widely interpreted as confirming his organization's responsibility. The video was not a denial. It was a discussion. It was a statement that was widely understood as an acknowledgement of Al-Qaeda's role. Al-Qaeda's own communications, recovered over subsequent years, documented the planning of the operation. Messages were intercepted. Letters were found. Planning documents were recovered. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed identified as the operational architect of the attacks, was captured in Pakistan in 2003. He subsequently claimed responsibility for the September 11th attacks and provided extensive detail about the planning process. He described the planning. He described the meetings. He described the funding. He described the recruitment. He described the selection of the hijackers. He described the training. The evidentiary record connecting Al-Qaeda to the attacks is, by normal standards of criminal and intelligence investigation, robust. It is not a single piece of evidence. It is a large body of evidence. It is a body of evidence that was gathered by multiple countries, by multiple agencies, by multiple investigators. It is evidence that has been tested, examined, and reviewed. That is why the Al-Qaeda evidence base remains one of the strongest counterpoints to the inside job hypothesis. The human cost of persistent doubt. This point deserves to be made gently but clearly. The families of the nearly 3,000 people who died on 9/11 have, in many cases, found the persistence of conspiracy theories about the attacks to be deeply painful. They have been subjected, over the years, to the suggestion that their loved ones' deaths were not what they appeared to be, that the grief of that day was manufactured or exploited. That is not a small thing. When someone dies in a tragedy, the family wants to know what happened. They want to know why. They want to know who. They want to know how. But they do not want to hear that their loved one's death was a lie. They do not want to hear that the grief they feel is a product of a conspiracy. They do not want to hear that the tragedy was manufactured. That is not just theoretical. It is personal. Some families have themselves asked difficult questions about the official account, particularly regarding the Saudi connection documents and the adequacy of the intelligence failure investigations. These are legitimate questions pursued through legitimate channels. It is important to distinguish between those questions and the broader conspiracy framework. The Saudi documents were classified. They were released late. The intelligence failures were real. The questions about those issues are valid. But the broader conspiracy framework, the inside job narrative, has, in the lived experience of many survivors and family members, added a layer of cruelty to an already unimaginable loss. That doesn't make the questions illegitimate, but it is a human dimension of this particular subject that deserves acknowledgement. Because at the end of the day, the conspiracy theories are not just about evidence. They are about people. They are about the families who lost loved ones. They are about the survivors who lived through the day. They are about the communities that were affected. And for those people, the persistence of the conspiracy theories is not just an intellectual exercise. It is a source of pain. That is why this point deserves to be made gently but clearly. The theories have a human cost, and that cost is real. The open questions, we have walked a long way tonight through a difficult landscape. We have traveled through the theories that attract the most attention and the ones that linger in the shadows. We have heard the technical arguments and the geopolitical ones. We have sat with the official explanations, and the alternative ones. We have given weight to the engineering record and to the human cost of persistent doubt. And now we arrive, as we always do, at the questions that don't resolve. Not because the evidence is hidden, necessarily. Not because the investigation was inadequate, but because what we know and what we can prove and what we feel are three different things, and they don't always point in the same direction. That is the space where the open questions live. The first open question is the simplest and the most human. Why did the warnings fail? The 9/11 Commission documented in considerable detail that the United States intelligence community possessed, in the months before the attacks, information that in retrospect pointed toward the coming event. There was an assets reporting about Al-Qaeda activity. There were communications intercepts that were translated too slowly. There was a Phoenix FBI agent who warned about Middle Eastern men taking flying lessons. There were 2 of the 19 hijackers who were tracked by the CIA, but whose presence in the United States was not passed to the FBI. There were warnings. There were signals. There were pieces of information, but they were not assembled. They were not connected. They were not acted upon in time. The Commission called this a failure of imagination, that intelligence analysts and policymakers failed to connect the dots because they could not fully conceive of an operation of this kind on American soil. That explanation may be entirely true. It is entirely plausible that the intelligence community did not imagine the commercial aircraft would be used as weapons. It is entirely plausible that the system was not designed to detect that kind of threat. It is entirely plausible that the warnings were received but not understood. That is how large bureaucracies fail. Not with malice, not with conspiracy, but with inertia, with blind spots, with assumptions that are too comfortable, with information that is lost in the noise. But the explanation is also the one that would be given if the failure was something other than innocent. If the failure was deliberate, if the warnings were ignored because they were not wanted, if the signals were suppressed because they were inconvenient, the same explanation would be offered. The question is, which was it? We do not know, with the certainty that would close the question, whether the failure was structural or deliberate. The Commission reached a conclusion. Not everyone found that conclusion sufficient. That is the open question. Not whether the warnings existed, they did. Not whether the warnings were missed, they were. But why they were missed? Was it because the system was broken, or was it because the system was working as intended? That is the question that remains. The second open question involves the legal proceedings that are, as of this recording, still ongoing. The Military Commission's trial of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 co-defendants who face charges related to the planning of the 9/11 attacks has been proceeding at Guantanamo Bay for more than 20 years. It began in 2008. It has been delayed repeatedly by legal motions, jurisdictional disputes, questions about the admissibility of evidence obtained through enhanced interrogation, and procedural complications that have made it one of the longest-running pre-trial processes in American legal history. A trial has not yet been concluded. A verdict has not been rendered. The men most directly associated, in official accounts, with the planning of the attacks have not yet been convicted in a court of law. That is significant. This is not evidence of innocence. It is a reflection of the legal and procedural complexity of military commissions dealing with evidence gathered under extraordinary post-September 9th circumstances. The evidence was obtained in ways that were legally controversial. Some of it was obtained through enhanced interrogation. Some of it was obtained in secret. Some of it was obtained in circumstances that make it difficult to use in a traditional court. The military commissions are not traditional courts. They are special tribunals designed for a special purpose. They are designed to handle evidence that ordinary courts cannot handle. They are designed to balance national security concerns with the need for accountability, but they are slow, they are complex, they are fraught with legal complications. And so the trial continues. 20 years later, without a verdict, the absence of a completed public trial means that the full evidentiary record has never been tested in the way that ordinary criminal cases are tested. In an ordinary criminal case, evidence is presented. The defense is able to cross-examine witnesses. The evidence is challenged. The jury hears the full record. The verdict is rendered. The process is transparent. In the military commissions, that process is not the same. The evidence is not fully public. The cross-examination is not fully public. The proceedings are not fully transparent. That absence, for some people, leaves the question open in ways that a completed trial might not. It is not that the defendants are innocent. It is that the process has not been completed. It is that the evidence has not been fully tested. It is that the verdict has not been rendered. That is the open question. When will the trial conclude? What will the verdict be? Will the full evidentiary record ever be tested? Those questions remain. The third open question is about the Saudi documents. We know that the 28 pages existed and were classified for 12 years. We know that when they were released, they documented connections between some of the hijackers and individuals with ties to Saudi intelligence. We know that subsequent FBI documents identified at least one of those individuals as a Saudi intelligence asset. That is what we know. What we do not fully know is how deep those connections ran, who authorized them, and whether they represented the actions of rogue individuals or something sanctioned at a higher level. The FBI has maintained that the investigation did not establish Saudi government institutional responsibility. Civil litigation by 9/11 families against Saudi Arabia has produced additional document requests that have not all been satisfied. This is a question with living institutional stakes. It involves the relationship between the United States and one of its most important strategic partners. It involves the families of nearly 3,000 people still seeking answers and accountability. It involves the tension between national security and public transparency. It is not closed. The 28 pages were not just classified. They were hidden. They were not released for 12 years. That is a long time. That is longer than many people wait for other kinds of classified information. Why were they hidden? Was it because the content was sensitive? Was it because the content implicated a strategic partner? We do not know. The FBI has maintained that the investigation did not establish Saudi government institutional responsibility. But the investigation was not complete. The documents were not fully released. The civil litigation is still ongoing. That is the open question. How deep did the connections run? Who authorized them? Were they rogue individuals or sanctioned actions? Those questions remain, and then there is the question that sits, as always, underneath all the others. What does it mean that so many people, more than half of Americans, according to some surveys, and comparable numbers in other countries, believe their government was concealing something about the worst attack on American soil in modern history? This is not primarily a question about evidence. It is a question about trust. 9/11 happened in a specific moment, a moment when the relationship between ordinary citizens and their governments was already strained by decades of documented deception. The Vietnam-era Pentagon Papers, Watergate, the Iran-Contra affair, the weapons of mass destruction justification for the Iraq War. In that context, skepticism about official accounts is not paranoia. It is, in a certain sense, historically learned behavior. People have been lied to, people have been misled, people have been told things that were later proven false. So when the government says something new, people remember the old things. They remember the times when the truth was hidden. They remember the times when the official account was wrong. That is not paranoia. That is memory. The question of whether the government was truthful about 9/11 is inseparable from the broader question of whether governments tell the truth about things that matter. And that question does not have a clean universal answer. Sometimes governments tell the truth, sometimes they do not. Sometimes they tell the truth partially. Sometimes they tell the truth with a delay. Sometimes they tell the truth under pressure. That is the reality. And that is why the question of 9/11 is not just about 9/11. It is about everything that came before. It is about everything that came after. It is about the relationship between citizens and their governments. It is about the history of deception. It is about the memory of betrayal. What we know is that something happened on the morning of 9/11/2001. That changed the world. We know that nearly 3,000 people died. We know that their families have spent more than 2 decades seeking understanding, accountability, and peace. We know that questions were asked immediately, that some of those questions have been answered, and that some of them have not. And we know that the asking of those questions, however uncomfortable, however contested, is part of how democratic societies process events that exceed their capacity for immediate comprehension. That does not make every theory right. It makes the asking human. Because in the end, the open questions are not just about evidence. They are about meaning. They are about the need to understand. They are about the inability to accept that something this large can happen without a larger explanation. That is human. That is why the questions remain. Night after night, the sky is still there, the moon is still there, the stars are still there, and the questions are still there, waiting, patient, unresolved, and that is enough to think about. Tonight, we travelled through one of the most difficult and contested landscapes of recent history. We started on a September morning in 2001, a morning that began perfectly. The sky was blue, the air was cool, the city was alive, people were going to work. Coffee shops were open, trains were running. Everything was ordinary, and then everything became something else entirely. We walked through the architectural debates and the classified documents. We sat with the geopolitical theories and the technical arguments. We gave fair weight to the counterpoints. We let the open questions remain open. We did not rush. We did not force a conclusion. We let the story unfold at its own pace. And now it is late. And there is something particular about the September 11th theories that is different from most of what we explore in these long, quiet hours together. Most conspiracy theories are, at their core, about events distant enough in time or place to feel somewhat abstract. Roswell happened 78 years ago. The moon landing happened 57 years ago. The ancient aliens theories stretch back thousands of years. These are history. They are far enough away that we can examine them without the weight of personal memory. 9/11 is not yet history in the same way. It is memory. For a very large number of people alive today, it is personal memory of where they were, what they were doing, how they heard, and how long it took for the world to feel normal again. Some people were at work, some were at school, some were driving to work, some were watching television, some were sleeping, some were in the towers, some were in the Pentagon, some were on the planes, some were in the air, some were on the ground, some were miles away, some were right there. Everyone remembers. When we walk through the theories around an event like this, we are not just examining the past. We are examining something that is still, for many people, unhealed. That deserves to be held gently. Whatever the full truth of that morning turns out to be, and the full truth, in all its complexity, may not be knowable in our lifetimes. What is certain is that the people who died deserved better than the world gave them. The first responders who ran towards the smoke while everyone else ran away. Firefighters, police officers, paramedics, EMTs, they did not know what was coming. They only knew that people were in danger. They went anyway. They kept going until they could not go anymore. The passengers who voted, in the last minutes of their lives, to resist, they were on a plane, they were told what was happening, they knew what would come if they did nothing, and they chose to act anyway. They chose to fight. They chose to try. They chose to give their lives for the chance that others might live. The office workers who had simply gone to work. They were planning their day. They were thinking about lunch. They were thinking about meetings. They were thinking about their families. They were not expecting to die. They were not expecting any of this. They were just living their lives. They were not symbols. They were not statistics. They were not political tools. They were people. They had names. They had families. They had friends. They had dreams. They had memories. They had stories that will never be told. And the questions we ask about what happened to them, however they are answered, should be asked in that spirit. Not to score a point, not to confirm a framework, not to prove a theory, not to win an argument, but because questions asked honestly are how we honor the things we don't yet understand. Because sometimes Asking the question is the only way we can make sense of what has happened, because sometimes the question is the only thing we have left. The morning of September 11th is over. It has been over for 25 years. But the sky that was so blue that morning is still up there. It has been blue many mornings since. It will be blue again tomorrow. There is something in that, in the fact that the sky continues, that mornings continue, that the world, whatever is done to it, persists. That is worth carrying into sleep. The world did not end that day. It changed. It was wounded. It was shaken. But it did not end. People still wake up. People still go to work. People still fall in love. People still have children. People still grow old. People still die. People still live. The world continues. And that is something to hold on to. Not because it erases the past. Not because it makes the pain go away. But because it shows that the world is bigger than any single day. Bigger than any single event. Bigger than any single tragedy. The world is bigger than 9/11. And that is worth remembering. You have spent this evening with difficult things, and you held them with care. You did not rush. You did not force a conclusion. You did not try to resolve what cannot be resolved. You let the questions be what they are. You let the story be what it is. That is enough for tonight. There is no need to carry the questions into sleep. They will be waiting tomorrow. And the day after that. They are patient questions. They have been waiting for an answer for a long time, and they have learned not to be in a hurry. You do not need to solve them tonight. You do not need to hold them tightly. You can let them rest. You can let yourself rest. The sky is still up there. The morning will come again. The world will continue. And, for now, that is enough. Rest well.